Good morning and welcome to the 2021 Sunstone Symposium session number 212, 1,000 Years of Mormonism. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, there is more than one way to Mormon. We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given a space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. After the symposium, Sunstone staff will edit, polish, and re-upload all of this year's sessions videos to the Whova app. It'll take about 2 weeks for everything to be available, but once it is, every video will be available to watch and rewatch in the Whova app through the end of 2021. Please type any questions into the Whova app to be addressed during the Q&A about this presentation. What could Mormonism look like upon reaching its 1,000th anniversary? This session will compare Mormonism with belief systems and social structures that have survived for long periods of time. Expectation for 21st century Mormons will be proposed. I would like to take a second to introduce you to our speaker before we begin. Brian Simper is allegedly a family history consultant in his Arizona ward, although he's a big slacker when compared with his wife. Most of his time is spent as a network security engineer, where he examines the appalling web traffic behavior of bank customers, and then he builds controls that protect online banking. He is married to his dear wife, who really does love family history research. They have 4 children, a daughter-in-law, and a freeloading cat. I would give the time over now to Brian.
Good morning. Can you see my screen?
It looks perfect.
Okay, great. This is Kongo Gumi. It is a company that builds traditional temples in Japan. The LDS Church might actually have some interest in a temple building company, but I propose that Russell Nelson might want to pay greater attention to the most notable trait of Kongo Gumi. It is the oldest continuously operating company in the world. It was established in 578 AD when Rome was still a recent memory and the Eastern Byzantine Empire was still trying to reconquer Italy. Christianity was still 400 years from the Great Schism, and Islam's great prophet Muhammad just turned 8. But 50 CEOs managed Kongo Gumi in an unbroken line that continues until today. Kongo Gumi was purchased as a fully owned subsidiary of the Takamatsu Construction Group in 2005. It's not quite as independent, but Japan loves its old corporations, and Kongo Gumi has a good chance to still be in existence in some form in another 1,000 years. Today, we will be discussing if the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has any similar prospects for celebrating its own 1,000-year anniversary in the future. We will discuss what it takes to build a long-lasting religion, particularly with a focus on what the LDS Church faces, and it is still 9 years away from its own 200th birthday. Let's lay out some basic ground rules. We are not discussing whether or not the LDS Church is true. If longevity is supposed to be a guaranteed sign of a one true church, then surely we would look at Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism at 2,000 years. Islam compares favorably at 1,400, but Christianity can't beat Judaism at 3,000 years and Hinduism at 3,900. I'm not speaking to you as either a critic or a faithful Mormon. Think of me as the guy who says, if the LDS Church is going to survive in the far future, it will take a miracle. And then both the critics and the faithful entirely agree with me for entirely different reasons. I'm just an engineer who likes reading history and science fiction. I'm not at all an insider with the LDS Church, nor do I have any illusions that any prophet, seer, or revelator who could affect the growth of the LDS Church would pay any attention to me. We're simply going to look at how the LDS Church might grow and what it might look like in the year 2830 AD. Forecasting the future is exceedingly difficult. Let's look at a brief and entirely oversimplified history of Christianity and see what we are up against. Approximately 33 AD, day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. A couple dozen Christians gather together, missionary work proceeds, and they have the charge to go into all the world and preach the gospel of Christ. The Roman world views them as yet another subgroup of Jews who won't worship the gods of the empire, as all good Christians should. In 133 AD, the government first establishes persecutions for Christians who won't worship the emperor as God. At 233 AD, we have widespread persecution of Christians, particularly under Emperor Diocletian later in that century. This was mitigated by 50 years of blood-soaked Roman civil war. By 330 AD, we have Constantine as the emperor who fully legalizes Christianity. Okay, who saw that turn of fortune coming? Things are looking up for Christianity. 433 AD, fully Christian Rome was recently sacked by the Visigoths and only spared further predation by Pope Leo negotiating with Attila the Hun to prevent more widespread destruction. The city of Rome and the entire Western Empire will collapse in another generation. And we are still 1,000 years from the Protestant Reformation. Author Tom Clancy said, "The difference between fiction and reality is that fiction has to make sense. No matter how successful Christianity has been, it was certainly not a long string of unmitigated success. The fortunes of the largest faith on this planet has a ridiculous history as events changed, nations rose and fell, and religious leaders lived and died. Numerous schisms have arisen, and today we're only seeing the most successful along with some new upstarts. This is one of the lessons of an organization that lasts far beyond a single human lifespan. No nation, empire, or religion has an unbroken string of success and victories. They need a core of myth and belief to keep people coming back." We will get to some of those core traits, but let's examine a couple of traits that get headlines but contribute less than we think. The discovery that the LDS Church has more money than many small nations through Ensign Peak advisors came as a surprise to both believers and skeptics. By all accounts, Ensign Peak is holding $120 billion for the LDS Church. This is not counting real estate assets. The additional surprise is that this fund is allegedly growing at 7% per year. This is a hilariously unsustainable growth rate. Under the unrealistic assumption that this growth rate somehow continues, the balance sheet of Ensign Peak in 2830 AD will be $75 decillion. This sounds like an entirely made-up name and amount, but that's what it will be. If this were converted into $100 bills, the United States currency, this would be a globe of greenbacks with a radius of 59,000 kilometers. This is about 800 times larger in volume than our home planet. So let's just throw that money into a lousy 1% savings account. This is crazy since any financial institution on the planet that could possibly hold that amount will do everything in their fiduciary power to make it grow faster than 1%. But under that assumption, in 2830, we are still at $379 trillion. The estimated total wealth in the entire world in 2021 is 431 trillion US dollars. It's only a bit larger than 2830 Ensign Peak. Now, don't go thinking that this indicates how the LDS Church is destined to rule the world in the 29th century. This forecast runs headlong into all the possible problems with changes in economic policy, inflation, and debt-based economies. The deeper and quite valid concern is that in a bureaucracy of this size, decisions might be influenced by that bottom line and not necessarily by revelation. The problem with dealing with money at that level is that you would not be owning that money as much as that money is likely owning you. However, for the foreseeable future, the financial concerns of the LDS Church are not the big challenge. By all moral estimates, the future population of the LDS Church should be a bigger concern than the balance statement of Ensign Peak. The LDS Church continues to release yearly statistics at April General Conference and in the May Ensign or Liahona magazine. I will summarize some numbers, but you do not have to take my word on this data. Just pull up the May issue of the Ensign going back to 1970 and look up the General Conference statistics report. Make a spreadsheet of membership total, number of wards and stakes, convert baptisms and births for the year, each year. Seriously, collecting that data will take you like less than an hour. We will begin by looking at people entering the LDS Church. There are only two ways that a person becomes a member of the church, by birth and baptism. And equivalently, there are only two ways that a person leaves the church, through deaths and exits, resignations, things like that. From an engineering standpoint, we have a system with a measured volume with two inputs and two outputs. Luckily, births and baptisms are published annually. Deaths and exit numbers are not announced. However, the LDS Church publishes the total population in each reported year. This is the natural equation for the population change in any year. Deaths can be very reasonably calculated from the known published death rate of the entire population in a country. Surely all that clean living for the word of wisdom would not cause Mormons to die at a higher rate than the entire population. Crude mortality rate refers to the number of deaths per 1,000 people over a year. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the current mortality rate of the United States is 8.1 deaths per 1,000 people in the population. This is paradoxical because by comparison, we have Western-style countries with higher death rates. This does not mean that Mexico or Bangladesh are safer countries to live in, or that Italy and Bulgaria are more dangerous. If the birth rate is much higher than the death rate, this means that the calculated mortality rate will be low. Lower birth rates and higher longevity in Western nations results in an older population and, ironically, a higher mortality rate. That lower mortality rate in Bangladesh and Mexico will go up over time, but currently births far outpace deaths. It's worth breaking out these numbers by US state. So we should look at the usual LDS suspects in Arizona, Utah, and Idaho. The Mormon corridor has a slightly lower mortality rate than the entire nation because of a higher birth rate. I will openly note that different organizations show the US rate anywhere from 7 up to 8.2, depending on collection methods. Now let's talk about people that leave the LDS Church while still alive. This crowd knows all about the best ways to terminate your membership. But since we have some numbers for birth, deaths, and baptisms, the people exiting from all other means should be easy to calculate. But here's where we run into the problem. I suspect you will be slightly disappointed by what we find. I don't want to begin with a giant table of numbers, which will be guaranteed confusing. So let's just start with one year that demonstrates the problem. In the April 2000 General Conference, the membership of the church at the end of 1999 was announced at 10,752,000. During the year 2000, the LDS Church added 81,000 births and almost 274,000 baptisms. These are respectable numbers, and we get more than 11 million by the end of the year. This is what the population of the church would have been at the end of 2000 if no one died and no one left the church that year. The announced membership total at the end of 2000, announced in 2001, was smaller, of course. This means that all the deaths plus all the exits must have been the difference between those numbers at 39,000. Good so far. The mortality rate of a group of Westerners largely would be about 7 per 1,000, and that means the expected deaths would be 75,000. Now we see the problem. The expected deaths are almost double what both the deaths and exits could possibly count. There is no room for anyone to leave the church for reasons of unbelief, and about 36,000 more people would be expected to have passed to their heavenly reward. The numbers do not add up. And it's not just this one year I pulled out. Here's the giant spreadsheet of numbers that I was warning you about. There are a couple years where the figures do work out, but the numbers go all over the place. Having a negative number in that last column makes no demographic sense. I played with lowering the mortality rates to see if anything improved. Here it is at 5 people for 1,000, 5% mortality rate. But even at the impossibly low mortality rate of 1 out of 1,000, there was still 1 year with a negative number for live people exiting the church while still alive. No country on earth has a 1 out of 1,000 mortality rate. If these numbers were completely accurate, then the missing membership column should be close to 0. Negative numbers in red mean the likely deaths outstripped any growth and produced nonsense. You would literally need mass resurrections to make that work. But positive numbers in black mean that people resigned their membership, often along with a death rate that is impossibly too low. Ideally, what any church wants is for that last column to be close to 0. My guess is that this is what happens if you keep inactive people on your rolls for absolutely as long as you can, even if it might be until they are beyond an expected lifespan. For example, if people were on the rolls until they were 110 years old, or if people that leave the church were still counted in the total membership. I don't have any inside knowledge of the counting procedure, but those two rumored policies would certainly explain what is happening. So let's apply a couple of our own assumptions. Published numbers imply that more than 16 million people are sitting in sacrament meeting each week in 2021, and there is no way that is true. Any ward clerk knows the activity rate of their ward. Let's assume that the overall activity rate of the LDS Church is 33%. I think this value would be a good guess to either the host of an ex-Mormon group or a realistic Elders Quorum president. It's in the ballpark for the parable of the 10 wise and foolish virgins. Plus, it makes the math pretty easy. The assumption is that approximately 1/3 of Mormons showing up in church each week are the ones making life easy for ward clerks. Faithful Mormons get a new membership record created for their babies and invite their neighbors to meet with missionaries. So the births and convert baptisms would stay the same, but the total population of the LDS Church is largely assumed to be under 6 million, the active group at least. Now, even with a mortality rate of 7 per 1,000, we have plenty of extra slots for people leaving the LDS Church. These are sobering numbers depending on the state of your testimony. But I'll assume that the majority of the births stick around for a decade or two, and I'm less optimistic about those baptismal candidates remaining for a year. There's no clear evidence here that upwards of 250,000 people are sending in notarized membership cancellations to the records department annually. I would guess at least 2/3 of that number simply disappear into inactivity, but there is still lots of room for new people showing up at apostate coffee meetups. This hypothesis is pretty out there. Let me reiterate that these are based on numbers publicly released by the LDS Church, and I'd happily revise them with more accurate numbers if they be provided by someone who has better information, like the LDS Church Records Department. But if those numbers provided for us were from official channels, let's take them at their word and push forecasting into at least the next century. Now, population forecasting is never perfect, but this was a popular model that my high school seminary teacher would have enjoyed back in the 1980s. It assumes that convert baptisms and births would continue from their stellar numbers back during the years of Ronald Reagan's presidency. We'll use a simple model by averaging the percentage growth rate during those years. The LDS Church grew at an annual rate of 5.29% in that decade, which is remarkable. If that were to continue, by the year 2100, we would have nearly 2 billion members, having eclipsed our Roman Catholic friends, and would likely be a dominant force in politics and pop culture. By 2132, there would be 10 billion members of the church, which would functionally be every human on the planet. We had a good decade in the 1980s, but that kind of inflationary growth starts to look just as crazy as the growth model of Ends and Peak a few minutes ago. Let's look at some models with a bit more sober outlook, as befits a religion that forbids alcohol. Now, I wanted to use this equation I showed you, but after a few days of playing with the numbers, the same types of results kept coming out, which was that future predictions simply reflected the numbers I put into them. Seriously, it all comes down to the simple mathematical expression of whether the inputs or outputs are larger. On the left is when the population growth has births and baptisms slightly larger than the mortality rate and the exit rate, and on the right shows the exit mortality rate larger. The curve either rises to infinity or drops to zero. Seriously, I invented several models and none of them look like reality after a couple of decades. The baptisms, births, deaths, and exits are all based on numbers that are unchanging, which is entirely too simple. After all, these are the historical numbers of births and baptisms over the last 20 years. Assuming these numbers are accurate, we have broad spikes up and down in the numbers. I cannot reliably model a system containing humans affected by complex influences. Could be pop culture, world events, politics, gospel topic essays, some new podcast, or some new church program. The best we can do is have some rules that show the general direction of the church. Based on the limited public numbers, here's the equation. You can play as a home game each April if you want to get a current indicator of how the church is doing in any year. Incoming births, members as births and baptisms, and there's outgoing members as total membership based on a fairly well-established mortality rate. This is just modeling some simple models, and resignations are only going to make those outgoing members larger. This is what those equations produce for the last 20 years. Those two numbers are slowly converging. If you want to add in an assumed number of resignations, those numbers are going to converge much faster. You can establish a betting pool on when you think those lines will cross and the material decline in membership should be announced. I had this data a moment ago, and the birth rate needs to be mentioned. These are births per 1,000 people. One of the more historically reliable ways to get new members of any church is through having babies. Unfortunately, 2020 was not a good year for the birth rate within the church. I think that a lot of Mormons enjoyed the COVID lockdown so much that they decided to do it in perpetuity. The problem is that they took their infant children with them and did not get a membership number for any new babies. Mom and dad might still be on the rolls being pursued by diligent ministering teachers, but the 2022 nursery classes will need far lower staffing at this rate. These numbers could change dramatically, but the trend is certainly not up. I don't want to sound cynical, but I would not be surprised to see increased emphasis on marriage and families in upcoming ward, stake, and general conferences. You would think that surely the youth lesson manuals emphasize marriage and children quite enough already. Based on conference talks in the last few years, I expect the LDS Church will continue to push for marriage and family in the heteronormative style that they have come to expect. If you want changes in the LDS Church on any topic whatsoever, your best strategy is to show how it will materially affect the growth of the church in some measurable way. The LDS Church is trying to remain viable and growing for at least 1,000 years, and converts alone are not going to fill the pews. Those converts are still arriving each year. This graph shows the number of converts per 1,000 existing members annually. However, the published baptism numbers are not only in decline, they are hiding a problem that virtually everyone knows about. Too many converts drift out of activity within their first year and never return. The much more interesting follow-up number to baptisms would be first-time endowment sessions for the adult converts a year later. I guarantee that the church knows that number. If you suddenly decided to join the Roman Catholic or Russian Orthodox Church, you would not simply get baptized in 2 weeks after a half-dozen missionary lessons from a couple of teenagers and one attendance at Mass. While there is not a universally required amount of time to spend as a catechumen, a full year of weekly attendance on Sunday plus weekly organized study is commonly recommended. I have seen I've seen Catholic priests asked about this in Q&A discussions, and the common answer is that the process should not be rushed. Even the Jehovah's Witnesses insist on taking several months to commit to baptism. Knowing what could reverse this trend is probably a top agenda item for these apostles and mission presidents. One source of reliable data is with national populations. We can look at some models of nations that have the same population and growth as the LDS Church and see how they continued. I'm not claiming that this will necessarily turn out as an accurate model, but the comparisons were interesting. Plus, I found some professional demographers who forecasted population numbers up to the year 2100. I specifically looked for Western countries that had a population around the 2020 membership numbers of the LDS Church at 16 million, along with a similar percentage growth rate. For simplicity, I averaged out the percent growth rate since 2010, which turned out to be 1.733%. There were a few that closely matched. We have what actual demographers show for how these countries might grow through the year 2100. So this is Australia, Romania, and Taiwan. The data sets were taken from an investment firm that looks to grow money regionally. All three countries start from about 16.5 million in their different years, and the data you see shows measured census numbers up until the year 2020 and is projected beyond that. Australia is doing pretty well with linear growth. Taiwan has a slow arc up to a maximum population in 2029, where it begins gradually declining. Meanwhile, Romania has been in linear decline since 1989 with no end in sight. I did not plan for these countries to symbolically be the good, bad, and mediocre outlooks for the LDS Church. These are just raw numbers, but the politics, culture, and current events affect each nation. If the LDS Church grows like Australia, it gets up to 42 million in the 22nd century. It's a much more realistic rate than the 2 billion hoped for back in the heady 1980s predictions. The Taiwan and Romania growth are still possibilities. We should talk about some of the lessons of Christian denominations that have 2,000 years of history behind them. The oldest Christian churches are the Roman Catholic and various Eastern Orthodox and Coptic Christian churches. They have not only survived, but remain influential denominations today. The numerical models I tried to build earlier had huge assumptions beyond the mathematics. I had to assume that changes in politics, doctrine, and current events will not affect the growth of the LDS Church. But the history of Christianity is a blatant refutation of assuming that anything is ever stable in the world of religion. Crusades, Reformations, schisms, wars, and ecumenical councils all affected these churches. What you are looking at today are the survivors of this evolutionary crucible. This picture shows Pope John Paul II with Patriarch Bartholomew I of Constantinople. I'm sure you all recognize John Paul as the Pope, but Bartholomew is the leader of the Greek Orthodox Church and is commonly regarded as first among equals when meeting other Orthodox leaders like Patriarch Kirill of Russia. John Paul and Bartholomew had a number of significant meetings together. In 1995, they held a papal liturgy where the Nicene Creed was recited in Greek, but using Eastern Orthodox doctrine for the origin and procession of the Holy Spirit. Seriously, this would be like Russell Nelson holding an LDS sacrament meeting with Paul Eldon Kingston of the Latter-day Church of Christ and letting Brother Kingston bless the sacrament and give a talk on the history of polygamy. Obviously, the FLDS schisms are much more recent, and the feelings and concerns about those are a lot more tender. The Great Schism in dividing the Catholics from the Orthodox churches happened in 1054 over a series of deep theological disputes among about the question of Holy Spirit, as well as a number of other doctrinal issues. The Constantinopolitan Nicene Creed that both the Catholics and Orthodox still recite in their liturgy differs in one short phrase describing the Holy Spirit, and this phrase was not the only dispute. For the benefit of all the non-Catholics and non-Orthodox in the audience, this is the Creed. Note that the three words written in red, which Catholics retain and the Orthodox omit. This is called the Filioque Clause, and it is one significant basis of the 1,000 years of deep disagreement in Christianity. And seriously, they still talk about this. I won't try to justify or explain the doctrinal position espoused with the three words "and the Son." This is the subject of deep research and substantive translation issues and debate. As confusing as it might be to Mormons today, it was deadly serious for Christians of that era and remains divisive. In 1054, Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople refused several demands from Rome, including a requirement to recognize the Pope's claim to be the head of all Christian churches, and then assist with some conflicts in the West. Patriarch Cerularius refused, and he was quickly excommunicated by the papal legate sent by Pope Leo IX. Cerularius responded by excommunicating the papal legate. I will not be covering 11th century Christian politics to let all this to escalate quite so quickly. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade began, and this would end as a disaster for the Eastern churches. The Fourth Crusade is complicated and appalling on multiple levels. In 1204, the nominally Christian crusaders from Rome were convinced to attack and sack the Christian city of Constantinople. Let's simply say that politicians and money were heavily involved. This was an irrevocable wound to the Byzantine Empire. The Church of the Hagia Sophia was looted and artifacts were taken back to Rome. The schism was a divide that remains to this day, although in the last 50 years, some early progress is being made to mend that wound between the largest denominations in Christendom. So in 1995, when Pope John Paul II and Patriarch Bartholomew I held liturgy together, this was a big deal. In May 2001, John Paul became the first pope to visit Greece in nearly 1,300 years. He formally apologized for the wrongs Catholics had committed against the Orthodox, which included the sacking of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade. Then in 2004, John Paul and Bartholomew met and held the liturgy again. Bartholomew formally requested that some of the relics looted during the Fourth Crusade be returned to Constantinople. And John Paul did return the relics of Gregory the Theologian and St. John Chrysostom later that year at a divine liturgy held in Istanbul. This brief history is only an acknowledgement that these denominations have a long memory and a combative history, yet they have painstakingly come to peace with the mistakes of their past. There are still lots of issues remaining. The fruits of repentance have not yet fully been made manifest. But we are not here to point out Catholics and Orthodox issues. We are here to look at the strategies that allowed these churches to survive as deeply influential organizations for 2,000 years. And maybe the LDS Church might try some of these ideas. One of the major events that propelled Christianity from minority persecuted group to world religion was the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, and along with Emperor Constantine's embrace of Christianity. This was certainly critical for the growth and possibly survival of Christianity, but this was also something that no pope or bishop could have arranged. We'll be going over a list of attributes that Christians could control and made their faith able to take advantage of the good luck and divine blessing of converting a Roman emperor. The Nicene Council in 325 AD was just the start of a long series of church councils to clarify doctrine and respond to events. During the early decades of the 16th century Protestant Reformation, the Catholics responded with the Council of Trent. The council lasted from 1545 to 1563. That is an 18-year-long series of meetings to address the latest Christian schisms. I can't claim that this was completely successful, but most Protestant historians admit that while the Catholic Church suffered losses in the Reformation, the Church came back strong. It was willing to hold a multi-year meeting to fully address the issues. Taking a long time to make decisions and moving slowly has its downsides and will lead to short-term losses. The Second Great Awakening in North America happened in part because American settlers moved out beyond the reach of established churches on the East Coast. This led to the formation of a small group founding in 1830 by this guy, Joseph Smith, you may have heard about. With an origin story that begins with a young family, it naturally follows that Catholics and Orthodox forbid divorce and birth control. This doctrine does not always hold sway among the laity, but this strategy puts an emphasis on the longer time frame of the group and not nearly as much on the needs of individuals. As noted earlier, producing babies is a powerful driver of membership. Let me point out one additional aspect of family formation from the early Christian church. There was an early Christian named Beninius of Dijon in the 2nd century. He ran a ministry supporting crippled and abandoned children who had survived failed abortions or had been rejected by their parents. This was one of the particularly unsavory practices of Roman culture. Infants who were imperfect or inconvenient could be legally abandoned. They would simply be left to the elements on hillsides or the steps of a temple. In Rome in the early 3rd century, Bishop Callistus organized people to roam the streets in the late evening looking for abandoned children. He then placed them in the homes of Christian parents wanting them. This is only 2 of the instances of caring for abandoned children in Christian history. This is the kind of emphasis on compassion and commitment and family formation that builds a church that is going to last for 1,000 years. I read the book, The Da Vinci Code, and can assure you that Dan Brown's take on Christian history has large holes in it. But it was completely believable that the Catholic Church would be so concerned about its own history. Christian monasteries and churches preserved an endless number of historical and scriptural documents through the last 2,000 years. Mormons and other Protestants do not like the idea of praying to saints, but I want to note 2 aspects about this practice. First, this is functionally the same as calling up your mom and your bishop and asking them to pray on your behalf. And second, this practice, along with the feast day calendar for saints, makes Catholics have numerous examples as inspiration for their own lives out of history. Having a history, a long history, produces a more resilient people and church. I have some friends who are deeply conservative Catholics. When Pope Francis was elected in 2013, they remarked in a moment of shocking candor, "He's not my Pope." This is not an attitude that I could ever imagine in an LDS setting. No one ever says, "He's not my prophet." We have an infamous primary song called "Follow the Prophet." The Catholics do not have a "Follow the Pope" song because they know there is a subset of popes that a good Catholic should not be following. No modern Catholic would defend the sack of Constantinople. Catholics have to make peace with their past on many issues and still have plenty they're working on. Catholics have to make peace with schisms. It's not harm to find Orthodox and Catholic talks and writings that refer to our Protestant friends, when these differences might have gotten you killed in the 16th century. I have heard Catholic priests acknowledge that a profound renewal of a corrupt institutional church must happen at least every few centuries. Each of these traits build a remarkable resilience in an organization and a people. As noted earlier, the history of Christianity is not a string of successes. As American poet Charles Bukowski stated, what matters most is how you walk through the fire. It's not that you found yourself in the fire in the first place, or that perhaps you accidentally set the fire yourself. It matters that you acknowledge your mistakes and make peace with them. The LDS Church does not stack up too badly in this list, but there are places to improve. There is a reasonable focus on a long time frame. Temples are built to standards that might allow them to survive for that 1,000 years. Still, there's plenty of criticism over how long it takes to make some decisions, like with the 1978 Race and the Priesthood Official Declaration. That issue should have been addressed a century before, and I would not defend that century of prejudice and poor doctrine. Let me only state that the LDS Church is, as a result, less likely to take a chance on some other radical move. This is a two-edged sword, of course. Virtually all Christian churches are dealing with LGBT issues in a wide range of approaches on this topic. Obviously, no universal consensus has been reached, yet I seriously doubt that Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches will liberalize at all based on the timeframes and history they work with. I don't know how this will shake out for Christians in general, but I suspect that any decision will be based on very long-term thinking and planning by the Catholics and the Orthodox. Family formation is certainly an area that works well for the LDS Church. Encouraging family formation happens through youth lessons, even if there is lots to argue about the chastity lessons. Many LDS marriages are arguably too young, including my own, by the way, but many of them work anyway. By the way, the BYU system has been a brilliant source of bringing LDS men and women together into families. My own parents met and married at BYU, and this continues to be a common story. Having a sacrament meeting filled with small, distracted children is a clear vote for the future. I attended a friend's church where the sparse crowd contained no one under age 40. This is not an attribute of a resilient church that will continue for 1,000 years. The LDS Church loves its own history, and it loves history in the scriptures. But LDS study manuals have this enormous gap from the end of the New Testament up until spring 1820. This leads to a chronic myopia because the central assertion of the great apostasy causes a need for Joseph Smith's restoration. We have to have that gap. It's a difficult proposition to discuss Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and Anthony the Great because LDS discussions always have to include the statement that priesthood was not around and they did not have the full gospel. It makes relations with other Christian faiths more difficult because there is not as much common ground. Catholics and most older Protestant churches gain a lot of moral and philosophical strength from studying the great thinkers of Christianity. I suspect the next big apologetic challenge in the LDS Church could come from skepticism of claims on the great apostasy. But the LDS Church just about makes up for this with their emphasis on family history. With all the Christian history that Mormons don't study, they certainly know their own family history. Cataloging genealogical records is, I think, one of the most genuinely useful activities that the LDS Church does in support of civilization. Making peace with the past is slow at best. The LDS Church does not really enjoy dealing with their difficult historical events or their own schismatic groups. Many of these groups are here at Sunstone, and all of those groups consider Russell Nelson's favorite church to be the schismatic group. To the profound credit of the Sunstone organization, making peace with the various branches of Joseph Smith's restoration movement entirely does happen at the summer symposiums. The new gospel topic essays are an initial pensive attempt to make some peace with the most difficult issues and doctrines of the past. We will see how this proceeds. These are all ideas that would take decades to address, but that is the point of surviving to be a 1,000-year church. Let me offer one specific recommendation for making peace with the past. The LDS Church could greatly benefit with coming to terms with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This was not just a bad day in LDS history, it was arguably the worst day in LDS history. It was refreshing to see that the church made a rather complete account in their new book, Saints, Volume 2, No Unhallowed Hand. There is a sense of the authors trying to implicate as few leaders as possible. I'm sure one of the ex-LDS podcasts out there could have a fascinating episode going over what this book states about the facts and tone of the event as presented. I can give credit to the institutional church for providing a more complete description of those events than they ever have before, but I would recommend one more big step. Imagine a Sunday school lesson where the material covers the Mountain Meadows Massacre in some detail, just as the Saints book does. But a Sunday school lesson should state what we should learn from these events. We could state that the Mormons in Cedar City completely failed on all of the teachings of Jesus on forgiveness, love, compassion, and truth. The massacre happened because of unfounded suspicion and rumor, along with a desire for revenge. There was a general sense of wishing ill upon the Fancher party. History is filled with tragic stories where people did not live up to their ideals. This was the story of our people failing to follow those ideals, and we need to get that taught in church. We can at least have a Sunday school lesson where we recommit to following what should have been done. Similarly, Catholics do not enjoy talking about atrocities of the crusade, along with a long list of other historical events. But this is how repentance happens. As Proverbs 28:13 states, he who conceals his transgression will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will find compassion. Now, I don't want to leave out the skeptical and apostate community from these ideas of resiliency and longevity. These ideas are not just reserved for believing Christians. If the LDS Church is truly not meeting your needs, you should find a better place so you can thrive. If the LDS Church is hurting you, you should find a better place. And I fully acknowledge that this is a difficult process filled with emotional landmines. If you end up in another church, show them the commitment to your congregation that will make your former ward wish that you had stayed with them. If you're happier outside of religion and faith groups, then join or find or build something that is not only going to last, but is going to challenge religious belief systems. Don't let the Christians get away with lazy apologetic claims. Challenge them to produce a 21st century Thomas Aquinas. Challenge religion by being a principled organization committed to human flourishing and truth. How else are we going to have the science-based future we only dream about in science fiction? Seriously, even the strong believers in your average gospel doctrine class would not mind having this basic model for the future where we get to fly around the galaxy. The secular and science-based groups and podcasts I follow all want to build a society that will largely result in Gene Roddenberry's United Federation of Planets. Build something that will be resilient and last 1,000 years. This is what television shows and movies have been implying the future is supposed to look like. Gene Roddenberry was a secular humanist, and his vision of Starfleet had a society that appeared largely secular. But even Brother Roddenberry had an episode in the original series season 2 called Bread and Circuses. The crew of the Enterprise encounters a planet with a Roman Empire with 20th century technology and persecution of worshippers of a son of God. Captain Kirk openly states that Caesar and Christ both showed up on this planet. Starfleet at least knows about Christians in the 23rd century. We are a long way from that future. I can't guarantee that the 29th century will feature the 2000th semi-annual Galactic General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they have a fighting chance if they embrace the harder lessons of resilience and come to terms with their past and their challenges. I doubt any LDS prophet or apostle wants to be the guy that resets membership numbers to a completely accurate count of sacrament meeting attendance. But after that rather painful transition, the numbers of baptisms and births actually look pretty good. It's not perfect, but it would show a realistic and probably healthy core of believers that truly want to be present each Sunday. And those are the people with the resiliency to handle other difficult challenges of their faith for 1,000 years in the future. Thank you. Any questions?
Wow, Brian, that was just perfect. Thank you so much for giving your lens a color that was based in reality and actual published data. That's just perfect. We do have several questions from the audience. And first, we're going to start off with a sobering question. What new substances do you anticipate will be added or removed from the Word of Wisdom?
Yeah, I would love to know that. I think one of the most transformative things they could do would be to update the Word of Wisdom. If they just suddenly allowed coffee and tea, can you imagine the explosion of Starbucks alone in Utah? As much as Mormons like Swig and So Delicious, I think they would learn to embrace that. I wish I could be inside the room noting that when they make that kind of decision of how that's ever debated. I rather think that the leadership enjoys the way that Mormons are distinctly different in that regard, but a more common sense approach, even if they forbid tobacco, but allowed alcohol in moderation, perhaps. But heaven sakes, coffee and tea, I think, would be a no-brainer. That would be fascinating.
I think many people would agree with you on that. And I definitely thank Jack Waters for asking that question. Next thing, we have a question from Stephen Carter. And he says, a recent study said that many Americans consider their political identity as more important than their religious identity. Do you think that that will change the church's longevity?
Yeah, that's a complicated one in a great way. And part of it is that if you, that assumes that your politics are going to stick around longer than your church. If politics, particularly in the United States, but in the United States, presidential elections are marathons, where like in Britain, they're sprints, where the prime minister can be deposed at any time. Still, 2 weeks is a long time in politics. These things do change, but I mean, if you try to rehash the conservative claims, say in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president and won, obviously, I don't know that they would sound particularly relevant today. I can certainly see where the LDS Church has been at odds with many of its members in political issues based on immigration and many of the things about the pandemic for the past year. I think that the church realizes they're not fully in control of some of these forces pushing their members, but it would be absolutely fascinating to figure out if they would want to modify too much. They could come out with some distinct edicts on certain propositions, but I think it's like how the Queen of England can technically do anything she wants, but the moment she tries to exercise that power, Parliament will actually try to shut her down. In practice, she could. In reality, she probably won't. And I think the LDS Church leadership is in the same boat.
I think it's interesting to think about the presidential elections if we're talking from a United States-centric point of view, but think back to 2012 when Mitt Romney was the one running against Barack Obama and the role the church played in trying to keep that momentum going. And now looking at Mitt Romney in terms of politics, it's been really interesting with the church's embrace or, distancing from him.
Yeah, it's not hard to find people on Facebook who are active believing Mormons who openly denounce Mitt Romney at this point. I would add, however, in relation to Word of Wisdom, that it was Mitt Romney getting caught drinking a Diet Coke that suddenly allowed Coke to be sold in vending machines on BYU campus. Whether or not you like Mitt Romney, the media thought that was hilarious that a Mormon was found drinking Coke, and the church very quickly said, but drinking Coke and Pepsi are actually not disallowed by the Word of Wisdom. So thanks, Mitt, for at least that.
Wow, we need to get Nelson drinking some Starbucks.
Yeah, we need to catch some major politician walking out of Starbucks with a Frappuccino.
Exactly. Next question is from Bryce. And Bryce, I hope we'll get your name remotely correct. Bryce Blankenagel.
Blankenagel, I know him.
Okay, thank you. Wow, that was perfect. Is the declining birth rate consistent with national trends, and will the LDS implement a 10-child policy?
10-child policy, I can only imagine the immediate revolution initiated by the Relief Society alone, if that were somehow hinted at. The trends in the United States are that way. That is definitely down. If you want to have I covered this. I've learned about this in the past. In fact, my Sunstone presentation last year covered this in part. In that, if you have a group of people, you have to have a birth rate of a lifetime live birth rate of at least 2.1 children per woman over their lifetime to be able to have a stable population. And the birth rate, that birth rate of the United States has dropped below 2 in the last 10 years. But that's still ahead of most of Europe and most other Western countries. It's down to like 1.2 in Greece and Italy, which is remarkably low for those being Catholic and Orthodox countries that don't allow birth control. You'd think that'd be different. But there are some very large forces going on, and the LDS Church is weirdly one of the few that the church has successfully pushed back on that. The birth rate in Utah still remains above the basic demographic replacement rate. It would be fascinating to find out how the United States in general has low rate on that. Immigration is largely making up for most of that. And I can only imagine this is making heads explode among the laity of the LDS Church. So I don't know how that is going to shake out, but the trends are not up for the United States in general either.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you know, I mean, I don't actually know much about this, and maybe you do. Has the church ever officially stated that families need to be larger in terms of new children being added?
I haven't seen anything like that since the 1960s when they came out against birth control as much as possible. I think they would like to, but I think they're trying to be a little bit bigger tent Mormonism and not drive out the people who use birth control. Besides that, lots of conservative members of the church are known to use birth control. Either they're quietly done all the time. I mean, look at the number of children of the apostles themselves. Certainly, Boyd Packer had 10 children, but David Bednar has only 2 or 3. And I think that's pretty common, even among the apostles, coming from guys who were born in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And plus, you've just got to embrace people's ability to make those decisions for themselves. So I think
Yeah,
it won't change.
I mean, if they were to establish some distinct means of making family formation more affordable, that actually might make a difference. If I heard a joke years ago that tithing should be reduced by 1% for every child you have, and then you get a rebate at child 11. And while that's a hilarious idea, it would mathematically make some sense, and I'm certain there are faithful members of the church who might actually embrace that. I don't think it would make that giant of a difference, but I think it would make a difference in some people.
I think you're probably right about that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have another question from Joel Brown. Do you think the church's long-term vision is at all in conflict with the idea of Christ's second coming?
Sure, that is one that I found debate among very faithful members of the church. I've seen, I mean, you can find books published in the 60s that were quite confident that the second coming would be by like 1977, before Joseph Fielding Smith passed away, or I saw one crazy one that thought that Halley's Comet in 1986 was going to usher in some worldwide calamity. But I've also seen faithful members think, oh, it could be 300 or 400 years off still. We're just in the very early stages of this, despite major events like Israel now becoming a nation and the gospel being preached to all the world. But the LDS gospel isn't fulfilling the entire world like it was kind of assumed back in the high growth days of the 60s through the 80s. This is I have heard, I have some relatives that were not happy about the idea of science fiction in general, because if you have a future that is 1,000 years in the future and Jesus hasn't come, that kind of puts a damper on worrying about the second coming. If it's imminent, then you should be preparing. But if there was any evidence, for example, that the prophet indicated that it won't be until for another 50 years, then anyone who's likely to pass away in the next 50 years is suddenly not going to worry about the second coming. You just can't do anything about it. It's like when you hear about prophecies in the Old Testament concerning the coming of the Messiah, when it was 2,000 years past Abraham. Okay, the Messiah is 2,000 years in the future. That's not going to help me tomorrow. That's a nice idea. But if a prophecy occurs outside of the lifetime of the people hearing it, it is hard to continue making it relevant in their lives.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So another question from Bryce
Blankenagel. He's a nice guy. I like him. Yeah.
He has great questions. So this is a really good one. For accelerating membership numbers, would the LDS be better off holding to orthodoxy and remaining peculiar, or will we see a Black transfeminine prophet by 2077?
My wild guess is that we're not going to see the Black transfeminist prophet by any time this century. My guess is that they're going to play for staying relatively conservative doctrinally, because no matter what move the LDS Church makes, it's going to tick off some subset of members. If they liberalize, then the conservatives get ticked off and then go join Denver Snuffer. If they turn conservative, then the liberals get ticked off and just go inactive or resign. And so if the church is thinking, what group should we most attract and retain, they'd want to probably retain the people who are paying all the tithing, having all the children, and serving in all the high profile callings willingly. And that's the conservatives. I mean, look at the Amish, for example. They are demographically still thriving and growing, and they don't get the internet. They haven't updated their doctrines since the Anabaptists in 16th century. That's not entirely true, but they stay deeply conservative. Liberal churches don't tend to be on a growth path. That's part of the problem. I love the Community of Christ. I've attended some of their meetings, but their membership was heavily cut, and their growth rate is not nearly as impressive by percentage-wise as the Russell Nelson's church over the last 20 years since the Community of Christ liberalized. I think the church has watched that experiment play out and decided they're going to vote for staying in a conservative direction. And I'm even more convinced that a significant segment of the Catholics and Orthodox are going to play that even harder, sticking in the conservative direction. So
I don't know. I think that kind of is a gamble, honestly, but who knows how that's going to work out.
I totally agree. Yeah, totally agree.
So do you think as part of that, would it be beneficial or would it be a disadvantage to start talking about openly and admitting tragic or exploitive history to those conservative members?
Yeah, that's the one thing I think we need to do. The LDS Church, if you have an outsider talk to them, we just sound defensive. I've known investigators who have attended my ward, and I'm the crazy guy who just keeps his mouth shut most of the time, as you're probably suspecting. But they warn the investigators against anti-Mormon literature and stories, and I'm thinking you're just telling them to try to tread carefully through a field of landmines. That these things happened, and unless we comprehend them and discuss them openly and take real lessons from them, it's not going to improve things. I think polygamy is a huge problem in the sense that we have plenty of apologetics about it, but the one thing they've never really talked about is what is the core doctrine of why polygamy was implemented in the first place. Abraham was polygamous because he's from a Bedouin desert culture back in ancient Mesopotamia. David was a king, and David and Solomon, they were kings, and that's what kings do. And no one claimed it was a great idea, but it was part of their culture. Polygamy was never part of Victorian era Christian culture, and we don't have a good doctrine for why it occurred. The best I think I've ever heard is that, well, we believe God commanded it, and therefore here we are. And that is not going to be satisfying from an outsider perspective. The LDS Church needs to, I think, talk about that a lot more, because otherwise, as many other interviews on Mormon stories and Mormon expression and Talk Sunstone have brought up, when these landmines get tread upon, it causes lots of problems and leads to it leads to dissensions in families, leads to people leaving the church, and it leads to nothing that Russell Nelson wants to see occurring. They need to come to terms with it. I'm not sure the correct path forward, and they haven't taken all the steps that are going to fix those problems yet.
I am completely in agreement. And I feel like when people ask the hard questions and they get the dismissive, what we call hand waving answers in science that don't really get to the problem, they feel actually insulted. Many people do, or that they are being intentionally lied to.
Yeah. As I mentioned, my wife loves family history, and my oldest daughter years ago looked up Joseph Smith's family group record on Family Search and lists all of his wives. She's like, "Hey, what's up with this?" All right, tried to do that's what you want your youth, looking at Family Search, doing things. Yeah, she looks up Joseph Smith's record, and it was honest, at least at that time when she looked at it. I looked at it recently. The church has laid its own landmines.
Agreed. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we do have to wrap up. And this is from Kenyon Anderson. Bushman gave his opinion that on the topic of LDS correlation material, leaders have opted to appease the grandparents in San Pete County, often at the expense of grandchildren. To what extent do you think that some of the changes you've suggested here will come at the cost of the grandparents to ensure growth? And do you think that taking this approach might cause schisms in the mainstream LDS sect?
Sure, it absolutely might. But the correlated lesson manuals are so bland that they're just boring. If you do go through a Bible study in the Catholics Orthodox Church, you can find plenty that are really interesting about like the New Testament, about church history and what's happening in the first century in Christendom. But the LDS version of it is so boring, and it always has to come down to the LDS Church is true. I mean, I know, of course, they want to say that, but it doesn't draw people in. They've removed the history of it. I showed my son the Book of Jubilees is a book of scripture that was found most in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a reiteration of the book of Genesis, but it's the book of Genesis as if all the evil spirits got to talk, also get their point of view. It's really kind of a funny, entertaining book. It's not very long either. And he was looking through like, Dad, if they talked about this in Sunday school, I would have stuck around. It was much more interesting. They've removed all the interest out of it to try to not, to try to keep Boyd K. Packer happy in his attending Sunday school.
I think that's actually an accurate and valid point.
Yep.
Hey, thank you so much, Brian. This is really excellent discussion. I absolutely encourage everybody to keep this going on the Whova app. There is a lot of activity there. You should be proud of yourself, Brian. You started a great discussion. So now we're going to wrap up today, but I would absolutely love to thank you for attending and for supporting Sunstone. Continue this on in the Whova app. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.